Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we zap the seeds of weird and wonderful science directly into your brain. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, Peter Simson-Young talks about electric brain stimulators. First up, news of religious experience at the flick of a switch. The God helmet. After electroconvulsive shock therapy with alternating current to the brain was invented in the 1930s, but before the direct current transcranial stimulation of today was transcranial magnetic stimulation. Rotating electromagnets can deliver complex magnetic fields that can induce electric fields in the brain in a similar pattern to the electric fields the brain produces naturally. The fields are less strong than what you experience by putting your head near a computer, but they are precisely shaped. Professor Michael Persinger wanted to use this technology to stimulate creativity. He'd recorded the EEG of a woman who was meditating. He saw from her brainwaves that she was having a small partial seizure in her right temporal lobe, an absence seizure. She smiled and he asked her how she felt. She told him, "God was here. I felt his presence." People with temporal lobe epilepsy report more religious experiences than most people. He used the pattern of her epileptic seizure to induce the same experience in other people with a magnetic stimulation helmet built by his colleague, Professor Stanley Coren. 80% of the hundreds of people who tried it in a room on their own reported a sensed non-physical presence in the room, a feeling of an intelligent being standing nearby. At least one subject tore the helmet from his head and ran from the room. Depending on their cultural circumstances and personal beliefs, people might call the presence they felt God, or the ghost of their recently departed grandmother, or they might believe it was an alien, or they might just feel like they were hanging out with a double of themselves. Professor Persinger realised that this experience of another presence was the right hemispheric equivalent to the left hemisphere's sense of self. We're really two brains with some communication between them. And when there's a mismatch, you can feel a ghost is present. Persinger concluded that there's an enhancement of right hemispheric activity, and that this ultimately ends up being represented within the left hemisphere and you become aware of it. The ghost is yourself. Persinger investigated a case where a clock radio near a teenage girl's bed was emitting electromagnetic fields and causing her to have unwanted nightly episodes of a sensed presence with particularly religious overtones. When the clock was removed, the visions stopped. In 2003, Diffusion's own Dr. Tim Baines spoke to Eva Ferrados, a neuroscience researcher at the Institute of Neuropsychiatry at the University of New South Wales, and then actually stuck his head in the transcranial magnetic stimulation rig and had the language centres of his brain switched off while he spoke to her on the record. I replayed that interview in the January 9th episode of Diffusion 2012, titled Brain Magnets, Junk DNA and Nymphomania. There was a researcher who reported failing to replicate Persinger's results in 2004, so he widely reported that the God helmet only worked through the power of persuasion, that there were no magnetic effects on the brain. Persinger discovered that this researcher had run his DOS software on a Windows 95 computer and distorted the signals for the helmet. In 2014, researchers at the Integrated Centre for Experimental Research in Curitiba, Brazil, were able to replicate Persinger's results in a test with 20 people. Researchers have built on Michael Persinger's work to treat depression and other psychiatric disorders with transcranial magnetic stimulation. The problem was that the equipment is expensive and requires highly trained clinicians. This is where the use of small currents in transcranial direct current stimulation comes in. The equipment is smaller, cheaper, and simpler to use for psychiatric conditions. However, transcranial direct current stimulation has thus far not been reported to induce religious experiences. Professor Michael Persinger passed away in August 2018. You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. And now for some brain stimulation. Peter Simson-Young has a neuroscience and philosophy bachelor's degree with a master's in health technology innovation. He's now a scientific entrepreneur. I met up with Peter at the Ability Made Makerspace and began by asking him, what does a scientific entrepreneur do?
My interest is in commercializing medical devices or deep technology. So my background is in neuroscience philosophy, and then I studied a master's in health technology engineering at Sydney Uni, and since then have just been working on my own startup and another startup called Ability Made, both which manufacture custom-made medical devices.
So what sort of medical devices does your startup do?
So Ability Made manufactures 3D printed ankle foot orthoses, which are those leg braces that help kids work. And my own startup is NCAP Neuroscience, and we make a wearable technology using a technology called transcranial direct current stimulation. TDCS stands for transcranial direct current stimulation, and it's a type of non-invasive brain stimulation. And what it involves is you apply 2 sponge electrodes onto the scalp to apply a really weak electrical signals into the brain to sort of turn up or down the brain activity. And it was invented 20 years ago this month, I think, but it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that it's really picked up as a promising area to treat a range of neurological and psychiatric disorders like depression, chronic pain, and schizophrenia. The way it currently works is the patient goes in every day to receive 20 minutes of stimulation for maybe a couple of weeks, and then sort of this therapy stops. And the devices are just very simple little, effectively fancy 9-volt batteries that deliver this current through these salt water soaked sponges onto the head. So it's sort of like the very, very baby version of electroshock therapy, but without all of the side effects.
And so you're 3D printing elements of electrically stimulating your brain?
Yeah, so we take a MRI of the patient's head, and then we 3D print the headgear that holds the electrodes in the correct place in the head. So the main problem we have right now with brain stimulation is that it's confined to the clinic. So if you want to go get treatment for depression or chronic pain, then you have to travel all the way to the clinic every day, and that's if there is a clinic nearby that does that. And the reason it's confined to the clinics at the moment is because it's really difficult to place electrodes in the right place. So the way it works is you go in, you get your head measured, and they place these sponge electrodes over the bit of the brain that you want to target. And it's really complex, and you need to be quite well trained. So if there's a bit of a race at the moment to work out how do you put the electrodes over the right bit of the head without having to measure every time so that anyone can do it all the time. And we're trying to solve that problem with 3D printed custom-made devices.
So you can customize it exactly to the shape of people's heads and the structure of their brains.
Yeah, exactly right. So instead of measuring the head and put it in roughly the right place, we take this high-resolution anatomical model of the head, You model the electrodes there, and that not only gets it more accurate and precise, but it means that you can then use the head shape and structure to hold the electrodes in the right place. So what often happens is when the patient's getting treatment, the electrodes might drift. And that's fine, it doesn't have to be exactly in the right place. But if you're patient doing it at home and you're not trained, then you don't know how to look for that drift. Effectively, we're trying to make the first turnkey brain stimulation device. That is the first device that anyone can use without training.
So the ones already on the market for such things, they're not as precise.
Yeah, so at the moment, most of the devices on the market particularly for consumer applications, like there's a pair of headphones for sports and musicians, they're pretty inaccurate. So that, they're 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters off the bit of the brain that you really want to stimulate. And that's fine because the current flow is really, the electricity in the brain is really quite diffuse. There are other sort of similar methods that don't require measuring the head, and that similarly is a couple of centimeters off. On the flip side of that is if you go into a clinic and get your head measured, then it's super accurate, but it's not easy to use, right? So I'm trying to solve the problem of getting the balance between accuracy and ease of use.
And so these commercial devices where it's not dangerous because it's a low current, but where they're trying to get an improvement in athletic ability or musical training, do they work?
Probably, yeah, they would. There's one device commercially available for this sort of sports training, and it's called the Halo Neuroscience. They've played around with them quite a bit. And they've got a new one available now, which is quite good. What they do is they apply this weak currents through the motor cortex of the brain, which is the bit that controls your movement and action, and that can increase what they call neuroplasticity. And what that seems to do, and there's quite a bit of evidence to support this, is for complex tasks that require lots of tension and concentration, you get this sort of very small gain, maybe 5% in the learning rate of that complex task. So something by complex, I mean something that requires fine motor control. And that 5% probably wouldn't be enough to make a noticeable difference for you and I, but if you were an elite sports person or you're measuring those few percent, then obviously it's quite a big competitive advantage.
So what sort of medical conditions can be treated with this device?
So it's TDCS, or transcranial direct current stimulation, or I'll just call it brain stimulation, is relatively new, and the clinical research has only been going around for 5-10 years. So nothing's known for sure. The most investigated area is depression, and there are devices that were TGA approved in Australia for the treatment of depression about a year or two ago. And it seems to be not as effective as antidepressants, but about the same amount. But the important thing is that they can be taken together and they have a bit of a synergistic effect. There's some evidence that it's effective in stroke, and it seems to be an effective treatment for chronic pain to the extent of, I think, recent meta-analysis showed a reduction of chronic pain scores by about 17%. And one interesting area is in schizophrenia. There's not been in that many studies, but it seems to be very effective and seems to be reducing a lot of the symptoms by around 30%.
And so what other things can you do? So you can treat some of these illnesses and you can perhaps get 5% increase on fine motor skills. Can you meditate with them?
Yes, interestingly. There is evidence that you can improve some types of meditation, and I'm not totally across that area of research, but interestingly, Vince Clarke, who's done a lot of this research, has remarked at a conference recently that different types of stimulation have different effects on different types of meditation. So, for example, stimulation of the prefrontal lobe, the front bit of the brain, seems to reduce or stop your ability to do like a body scan, and other types of stimulations have different effects, which is quite interesting. There was a lot of interest a few years ago in using brain stimulation to improve your cognitive functions, or your memory and attention. But a lot of people started buying the devices to experiment on themselves. But the results are quite mixed about that. But I think one thing seems to be true is that the effects are what scientists call a baseline dependent. So if you've got like really great memory and attention and you stimulate your frontal lobes, then it seems to not do very much. But if you have like a reduced activity in that area, maybe you've got bad memory and attention, then you get a bit more of an effect. So you can sort of see this in some of the research done by the Air Force, where they were stimulating fighter pilots, and during the day they were getting no effects. But at night, when they were sleep deprived, it seemed to be more effective in improving their vigilance, or their wakefulness, more than caffeine, and for longer periods of time. So it seems like when the brain needs that bit of extra juice, it might help more than when it's fine.
There was a famous study about the US military using this to get people into a flow state for sharpshooting.
Yeah, I think the same thing applies though. It depends on the state that someone is in at that time. Yeah, I think if I can imagine if the person is a bit tired or cognitively declined, then I'm not sure. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the effectiveness in different conditions.
Is there a limit to how long you can be under the current before it's harmful?
There is a limit to how long you can be stimulated and it for being effective. So up to about 20 or 25 minutes, a bit of stimulation in the right way seems to increase like brain activity in the way that you're trying to do. But after that, the effect flips and you start having like a reduction. So there's something about this like sweet spot of 20 to 25 minutes, and anything beyond that's just having the opposite effect.
So you're not going to have fighter pilots having it built into their helmet and just wear it for hours and hours and hours because it won't work.
Yeah, exactly right.
But maybe it could be on and off in 20-minute cycles.
Yeah, I don't think there's that much research looking at how long between sessions get you the best results. I think it's like something like 12 hours or 24 hours. In the clinical research, what they're showing at the moment is that a typical course of using it for, say, depression would be using it 5 days a week for 3 or 4 weeks, and then a top-up dose, they call it, once a week for the following weeks. So it's probably something once or twice a day is the max you probably want to do it.
So if we get back to your startup and the customised 3D printed helmets, or what would you call them?
Headgear or a device. Yeah, so there's this like race to make the first home-based TDCS, like that would work for clinical applications. You can make, there are these consumer devices, but everyone knows that the second you can deliver this therapy at home, then you're disrupting the pharmaceutical industry. So my approach is quite unique in that we've decided that we're never going to be able to make a device that fits on all the different shapes and sizes of different heads. The only way we're going to be able to do it is just make one device for every different shape of the head, getting that head data and then custom making it for that patient's head.
And do you have a magnetic resonance imager at your business, or how do people get measured?
No, so it's very early stage at the moment. So we're using MRI scans that I've just got a bunch of MRI scans around from my friends from when I used to work in a lab at UNSW, and we're just making them with that. And we're starting with that data just because it's very high resolution. We know it's probably not the most scalable solution. There's lots of ways we could do it with, say, 3D scanning of the head, maybe even just a couple of head measurements. But it's easier to start with like the best data and then work our way down from that. Going back to your earlier question about how does the 3D printing work, what we found is that for the device to be comfortable and to fit a head well, it needs to be like a rubbery material. So we're actually 3D printing mold tools so that we can then pour silicon in and make that device that way. So we print the negative of the device, the mold tool, and then make the positive of the device from silicon.
And how does that fit in with your role at Ability Mate?
Yeah, so I joined Ability Mate in August when the funding for my startup ran out. We went through the same startup accelerator called Remarkable, which is the Cerebral Palsy Alliance accelerator. And my old friend Mel Fuller said, we need someone to join the team, and I'd just been working on custom-made devices with the Cerebral Palsy Alliance, which is very much in line with Ability Made's work. So Ability Made, as I mentioned, make 3D printed ankle-foot orthoses, and I joined them originally doing sort of marketing and operations, but now I've predominantly been working on as a sort of analyst roles, so much of the financial modelling and market analysis and a bit of product development.
And back to the devices, they can be used for meditation and for psychiatric treatment. Are there psychedelic modes?
There's no psychedelic mode, but one thing you can do, and it's not easy, is you can apply what's called TACS, transcranial alternating current stimulation, which is a similar technology, when someone is in a deep stage of sleep called REM sleep. And at certain frequencies, you can fairly reliably, about 30% of the time, induce lucid dreaming, which is probably the closest thing to a psychedelic trip you can do whilst asleep. The way they sort of did that was there was all this research using EEG, which measures brainwaves, and they observed that people during lucid dreaming had more of alpha and theta waves or something like this. So some clever researchers, Michael Nietzsche and others, thought, well, why don't we just apply some alpha and theta waves whilst people are asleep and see what happens? And yeah, they quite reliably induced lucid dreaming. I have tried it, but I've never successfully, it's never really done it, which is partly why I'm trying to make this device that I can sleep with. No, I'm joking.
And I guess finally, if people were to try and make their own ones at home, is there any danger?
There is danger. DIY brain stimulation is relatively low risk, but it's also very unlikely to be useful. It's very difficult, and I say this from experience, like this is how I got into it like 4 years ago. Really, like I heard about this technology and I was like, oh my gosh, I just have to try this for myself. And then I spent so much time trying to like make it work for myself. And I was like, this is just not possible. And then I started hearing from all these other people trying to like do it themselves. And a long time before that, I'd been working as a sleep technician. So my job was to measure heads and place electrodes. It was like, I knew I was like better qualified than most to do it, but it was just next to impossible. So my suggestion would be, if you're really, really desperate, buy a device online. If you can wait until they've solved the problem of how to like deliver it remote, like at home, and then or get in touch now and you can try and work something out. I think when someone solves the problem of how do you deliver brain stimulation at home, it is going to be huge. It's going to, for some people, it will not make a big difference. For a whole bunch of people, it will open up a whole new set of treatments. And that's because right now, all our treatments of the brain, like the brain is really complex, right? You can look at it at multiple levels, right? At the highest level are our thoughts and our beliefs, and at the lowest level are all these cells and neurons and whatnot. And now, currently, all of our treatments for mental illnesses are either at the level of like the neurochemistry or at the level of thinking and our thoughts and our talking therapies, right? Like pharmaceuticals target the cells, the talking targets the thoughts, but there's nothing in the middle, right? That we've learned so much about the brain, neural networks and like brain circuitry and all this, but we don't have any treatments that target. So once we have a scalable treatment that fills that gap between pharmaceutical treatments and psychosocial treatments like talking therapies, I think we'll have it'll be a really significant technology.
Well, Peter Simson-Young, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ian.
That was Peter Simson-Young talking about transcranial direct current stimulation, personalised by 3D printing.
I am the very model of a singularitarian. I'm combination transhuman and modalistic tropian. Aggressively, I'm changing all my body's biochemistry because my body's heritage is obsolete genetically. Replacing all the cells these bunches here just temporarily. The pattern of my brain embodies weather's continuity. I'll try to improve these patterns with optimal biology. But how will I do that? I need to be smarter. Ah, yes. I'll expand my mental faculties by merging with technology.
Expand his mental faculties by merging with technology. Expand his mental faculties by merging with technology. Expand his mental faculties by merging with technology.
And with a new technology, renewable clean energy, remove our pathogens and overcome hunger and poverty. In short, I am a transhuman, a modalistic tropian. I am the very model of a singularitarian.
In short, he is a transhuman, a modalistic tropian. He is the very model of a singularitarian.
That was Singularitarian by Charlie Cam. And that's all for this week on Diffusion. The news music was Rhinos theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 28 stations on the Community Radio Network, including 2 RBM in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, 8 CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2 MVR in Nambucca Valley, 3 MBR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia, City Park Radio 7 LTN in Launceston, Tasmania, 2 XXFM in Canberra, and my local station 2RDJ in Burwood, New South Wales. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com. Check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 950 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio. Make a donation through paypal.me/Ian Woolf. Subscribe to the Diffusion YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick. Everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.